Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. Continuing from our last lecture, which was an introductory attempt to take a kind of to clear some ground rules, to explain certain conceptual issues, and to point out the relevance of historiography in the discipline of history. Today, we are going to start with a first major attempt on writing history of India in the sense in which we normally now use the term history. This is not to say that earlier attempts were not made, or the attempts which were made earlier are less significant, but the way discipline of history has progressed in last 200-300 years, in that arena, this is the first major attempt and quite influential. So, we are talking about James Mill's History of British India. This came in 1817. On the screen, we have the cover page of this book, and as it is, this is the cover page of first volume. This came in 1817, and very soon it ran into several reprints. By 1826 or even earlier, the book in published form was expanded into 6 volumes, and this in many ways became a milestone intervention in conceptualizing history of India, particularly the way later writers, scholars, colonial administrators, they followed certain constructs which Mill had offered. Mill was an employee of East India Company at London office. He had great access to dispatches and reports from India. So, he had a vast amount of literature available before him. However, it is interesting that he had never visited India in his lifetime, and he defended it by saying that this is not a lack, rather a strength, because by this way he can dispassionately assess Indian society and its past. He began writing this magna opus 12-13 years back in 1805 itself. So, a considerable effort he put in. In many ways, this is a seminal text, extremely influential in the entire course of 19th century and even later on. This was a key text, as I mentioned earlier, for colonial administrators, and it was so influential and so powerful that Macaulay in 1833 declared it as the greatest historical work which has appeared in our language since the time of Gibbon. Such was the power of this work. In our historiographical journey, this is quite significant as it systematically offers a kind of justification for British rule in India. True to utilitarian spirit, for Mill, happiness was more crucial than self-rule, and we will come to this part later on. What does it mean? So, in a sense, he was harping back on evangelicists' idea that British rule in India not for their own profit, but to civilize the society in the colony. So, it is for the happiness, for the civilization, to inculcate cultural values, British rule is important. That is the argument, and this argument overarched the what we may call imperial attitude or imperial historiography of India. He divided Indian history into three, but instead of ancient, medieval and modern, as we saw in our previous lecture, the way European history and European past was divided. In Indian context, Mill divided it into Hindu, Muslim and British periods. However, by doing this, he is not setting any precedent, because there were earlier precedents following the same kind of communal periodization in India. What makes this book quite crucial and tremendously provocative is Mill's utter condemnation for anything related to India and Indian society and Indian past. So, he debunked the entire pre-colonial past, and that gave him a kind of platform, a justification, an intellectual justification for British rule and its efforts. This framework of Mill's can be understood in simple terms by going back to 3 points, 3 key points and 3 linked aspects, I would rather say. First, his adherence to the doctrines of what we call utilitarianism. Second, his appreciation of evangelicists like Charles Grant and John Shaw, who at the turn of the century was propounding a theory of white man's burden. As I said, it is the responsibility of white men to rule the non-whites and thereby to civilize non-whites. It is a very racial proposition. And third, due to these two, the linkages and the adherence to utilitarian principles, and his appreciation of evangelicists. Mill vociferously criticized and rejected Orientalist scholarships and Orientalist glorification of India's ancient heritage and classical knowledge. So, these three things we have to remember when examining James Mill's history of British India. Now, if we go these three aspects, these linked issues one by one, we come to a period of late 18th century, when Warren Hastings, who was Governor General of Bengal from 1773 to 1785, who encouraged efforts to discover this classical knowledge or ancient heritage of India. He motivated people like William Jones, and we have on screen an image of William Jones. William Jones came to India in 1783 as Supreme Court judge. Soon he became the president of Asiatic Society of Bengal. Earlier, Warren Hastings had encouraged Halhed to translate Gentoo code. Similarly, we have individuals like Charles Wilkins, Henry Colebrook. I am not going into the detail of their contributions, but merely informing you about the context and the linkages, significance of this period for our historiographical discussions. Returning back to William Jones, he was a Sanskritist, and he launched a project of the compilation of a digest of Indian laws based on Manav Dharma Shastra to help reconstitute Hindu polity on the basis of a legal tradition. He supported the current British practice in the courts to judge certain cases according to the laws of the community. What was being applied in this period and in these endeavors of William Jones, what was applied by the name of Islamic and Hindu laws in this late 18th century was in fact a new form of law with roots in both Indian and British cultures. They were quite appreciative of a large number of elements in ancient Indian knowledge traditions. So, a beautiful coming together of two civilizational resources one can witness in this period. However, here we must, as a history student, we must be cautioned that there were certain uncritical appreciations which were also taking place, and somewhere in these efforts the two civilizational domains were not unproblematic of their internal politics. However, this is a complicated argument, and we may save it for our later discussions. The core point at present is an undue, or probably undue may not be the appropriate word. However, this was the criticism which Orientalists faced by people like James Mill. They believed that William Jones was paying undue attention to ancient heritage of India. In this period of late 18th century, we see Fort William College coming up in Calcutta to embody Wellesley's ideal of an elite civil service thoroughly vested in the languages of the subcontinent. This was also to counter the spread of French revolutionary ideas. While William Jones and his group of Orientalists eulogized the ancient past and had condemnation for things medieval, for James Mill and his evangelical predecessors, the ancient was the target of criticism and ridicule. James Mill, for example, outrightly defined William Jones's attitude as conservative. So, after discussing, though even very briefly, William Jones and group of Orientalists against whom James Mill was pitching his ideas, now let us come to the utilitarian aspects, linkages, the frames in Mill's writing. For example, Mill's views on education and psychology were quite central to his attitude to India. He was an adherent admirer of Hartley's associationist psychology, which claimed that the organic, or a better word would be organizing principle of the human mind was the association of ideas. Following this thinking, Mill argued that human mind is tabula rasa at birth, like a blank slate, and education has all the potentialities. Education is capable of molding this blank slate, this mind tabula rasa of an individual by inculcating ideas best calculated to further individual and general happiness. So, that was the essential core idea or kernel in Mill's theorization or conceptualization of Indian society. By an analogy, he argued that India itself was a tabula rasa which could be molded according to utilitarian principles. Now, for the sake of some clarity, let me also tell you that the term utilitarian essentially comes from the doctrine which says that our endeavors, our efforts should be based on utility quotient. So, it is all our activities should be judged on the merit of whether it is useful or not useful. So, in that sense, utilitarian simply means usefulness. It comes from the term utility, and this was an essential criteria to judge cultures and societies. So, from this framework, Mill did not accept the claims of William Jones and Orientalists that historical narratives could be recovered from Indian mythologies and classical corpus. He firmly proposed that different codes of law in India should be replaced by a single comprehensive code formulated on the sole basis of their utility quotient, and the basis of this utility quotient must be measured in terms of the demand of the contemporary times. Mill in this manner was deeply influenced by ideas of Jeremy Bentham, who had argued that the legislator should be concerned with sensorial jurisprudence or defining what the law ought to be, rather than with expository jurisprudence or describing what the law is. This is quite important for us to pay attention to this difference. While for Orientalists, they believed that and they propounded that in order to rule a society, to govern a society, we must pay attention to the customs and the rules inherent in there, and then try to bring together two separate traditions. One, the knowledge tradition of the ruler, along with the knowledge tradition, the rules, the legal resources available in the society of the governed. Here in Bentham and then in Mill, we have a framework for the administrators which clearly propound that, advocates that there should be a singular frame, and this ought to be conceptualized and activated in the normative manner, where obviously the normative frames energy must come from Britain itself. Such a framework of history unmistakably gave certain intellectual justification for the British rule in India, where the goal was, as I mentioned and I would repeat again, the goal was not the self representation, not to assimilate ideas, not to pay attention to the ideas of colonial society, but firstly to judge a civilization on certain given parameters, which were again developed in a specific ideological frame from the ruling country, and then try to mold the society in those terms and conditions, in the fashion of that mold. And in many sense, this frame did lot of injustice to elements Indian, because in a sense this is a kind of multiple marginalization or creating or isolating, making Indian elements inferior, making Indian knowledge traditions much inferior than the European norms and frames. However, this became quite pervasive, as I was mentioning in the beginning, throughout the course of 19th century. And the dangers, it is not that the dangers and criticisms did not come, or dangers were not voiced and criticisms did not come. In fact, Max Muller held Mill's history of British India as responsible for some of the greatest misfortunes that had happened to India. There were other colonial administrator, historians who, though appreciated Mill's rigorous attempt and Mill's history of British India, but who also differed and pointed out lacunas in Mill's framework in 19th century itself. Two noteworthy individuals in this context may be mentioned here. One was Mount Stuart Elphinstone, another was Grant Duff. Unlike Mill, they had personal exposure of Indian society at different levels, and they could easily see the limitations of Mill's argument. Elphinstone, who had a wide readings and a curious mind, had encouraged generation of East India officers towards history writing. For example, Grant Duff invested his focus on writing history of Marathas. James Todd came up with voluminous account of Rajasthan. In the same tradition, later on we find Eliot and Dawson coming up in second half, later part of 19th century. Eliot and Dawson, we can say 1867, 1877, that is the 10 years time frame in which he came up with 8 large volumes on the medieval period, what was then called as Mohammedan period. And if we go back to Mill's framework and William Jones's attempt, while William Jones was eulogizing the ancient past, the Hindu period, so called Hindu period, and he was critical to the medieval past, the so called Mohammedan period. For James Mill, this equation got reversed. Mill was extremely rejectionist towards the Hindu period or the ancient period, and he was less critical about the so called Mohammedan period or the medieval period. Now, in Eliot and Dawson's effort, this further reversed, this equation flipped, and he focused on the so called Mohammedan period or the medieval period. Slightly later, another major intervention, though slightly different in nature, came in the efforts of William Wilson Hunter, W. Hunter, and for the first time we come across a huge data sets, statistical representation of Indian society in efforts of Hunter. He was also quite influential he was the man behind the project of Gazetteer of India series. So, though James Mill provided a kind of overarching frame for imperial historiography and imperial constructs of Indian society, there were different other strands even within British scholarship on Indian society, which need to be appreciated. The moot point of mentioning all these, of course, given the scope of this lecture, we can't pay attention to all these efforts individually, though they definitely merit our attention. But the crucial point to remain conscious about is that there is no homogeneous frame to look at historical writings scholarship on history even from 19th century, even coming from British colonial administrators. On the other hand, in 19th century, now before coming to that, let me go back and mention another significant inference, that unlike Mill, in efforts of Grant Duff or James Todd or Hunter, we come face to face, focus on regional dynamics. For Grant Duff, it was Maratha history. For Hunter, it was Bengal. So, which then took us deeper inside regional experiences, regional pasts. Again, I am not judging these efforts, whether these were representing authentic history, authentic past of the region or not. As I mentioned, that is not possible given the scope of our lecture. However, this shift of focus itself unearthed new set of information, new dimensions and new perspectives. On the other hand, now not quite unlinked by these efforts, a new terrain was emerging in context of disciplinary endeavors or even otherwise in terms of engagement with history. And in 19th century itself, and these were by scholars from India itself. So, for example, Bengal and Maharashtra and North India also in many ways witnessed crucial historiographical interventions, and these interventions were remarkable because these were in vernacular languages. So, for example, in Bengali we have efforts by Bankim Chand Chatterjee, and in our previous lecture I mentioned his historical novel and why that is important even for disciplinary domain of history. In Hindi, we have writings and engagement with history from Raja Shiv Prasad Verma, who is also known as Sitare Hind. He was school inspector in 1850s and he wrote several books dealing with education. Also wrote a famous tract called Itihas Timir Nasak. However, I would like to pay slightly longest attention to efforts which went into history writing, historical scholarship in the region of Maharashtra. That we will discuss in our next lecture, but Maharashtra in 19th century produced wonderful engagement in the field of history, and I would like to mention names like Gopal Hari Deshmukh, also known as Lokhit Badi. His time period is 1823 to 1892. Another key person is Ram Krishna Gopal Bhandarkar, 1837 to 1925. Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar, 1850 to 1883. Jyotirao Phule, 1827 to 1890, and Vishwanath Kasinath Rajware, 1863 to 1926. We will pay attention to their scholarship in our next lecture, and in this domain I just want to underline this fact that while 19th century witnessed British endeavors in history, a parallel or connected, not parallel but connected, one may call a response to British constructs, British efforts, British history of India came from native intellectuals. The second important trajectory we ought to pay some attention is how by second half of 19th century individuals like Dadabhai Naoroji developed a sound economic critique of colonialism, and so these two strands we will examine closely in our next lecture. Let me briefly explain the concept of white man's burden. The concept that dominated the consolidation and even the extension of the second British Empire soon after 1776 was that of a just and humane governance of colonies and statesmanship, for the lack of which Britain had lost her American colonies. In the 19th century, a clear distinction was made between the imperial economic policies towards the white man's settlement in the British Empire and the tropic colonies like India. Christian missionary evangelism by the turn of the century had derived its strength and momentum from the evangelicist revival, commencing with the foundation of the Baptist Missionary Society in 1792, the London Missionary Society in 1795, the Church Mission Society in 1799, and the British and Foreign Bible Society in 1804. The theory of this white man's burden is the ideology of empire being a field for the exercise of the Englishman's sense of philanthropy, liberal humanitarianism, and reformist zeal for the upliftment of backward communities and societies in the tropics. This ideology was aimed to rationalize empire building. Early Christian missionaries in this scheme had notable contributions, or they claimed their notable contributions in the awakening of India. Powerful challenge Christianity presented here to a hidebound, obscurantist and unequal society, which they believed was utterly unsuited to the changing times. In this context, let me also mention that Jeremy Bentham, who was an staunch anti-colonialist in earlier times, but who had changed later, had once asked, ought colonies already possessed to be emancipated? He himself answered, yes, certainly, if we only consider the saving of the expenses of their government and the superior advantages of a free commerce. But it is necessary to examine what is due to colonial establishment. Can they maintain themselves? Will not their internal tranquility be interrupted? Will not one class of the inhabitants be slaves to the freemen? Sorry, I repeat, will not one class of the inhabitants be sacrificed to another? For example, free men to slaves, or the slaves to the freemen? Is it not necessary that they should be protected and directed in their condition of comparative weakness and ignorance? Is it not their present state of dependence their safeguard against anarchy, murder, and pillage? When we shall cease to consider colonies with the greedy eyes of fiscality, the greater number of their inconveniences will cease of themselves. This is important, as we talked about how evangelicists and later utilitarians like John Shaw, like James Mill, privileged happiness over self representation and giving voice to the statement that English, the British rule in India was a white man's burden. They were ruling in the country not for their own profit, but to civilize Indian society.